I would like to invite Bart de Witte now to the floor. He is the founder of a Berlin-based non-profit called HIPPO AI Foundation that is dedicated to opening up medical knowledge and also to make AI-based healthcare a common good. Today, he will be talking about sustainable innovation, the power of regenerative AI and ESG to drive finance towards the common good. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the Academy of Science for the invitation. You might see that my vocabulary comes from a 20-year-long background in working for big tech companies, so I speak a bit different. I was responsible for 600 million profit and loss statements, and 4 years ago, I left my career to try to find a way in how we can advance AI and protect our European values, and especially in healthcare. I think this is quite important because we don't share the same values with, for example, the USA when it comes to protecting the health of your citizens. So I'm going to try to show where I went to and which theories I looked into and how we created or are creating a solution which is based on the regenerative economy and ESGs in order to create incentives for data sharing and open source. But let me first take you a step back. One of the social theorists that influenced me, as I mentioned yesterday evening during discussion, is Armin Nasehi. And in his theory of digitalization, he mentioned that the digitalization is nothing else than a duplication of the world through data. And when I was working in the industry, we mostly took data, and as we saw before, we start using machine learning to predict certain onsets. We do this for weather prediction. I worked for IBM. We bought a weather company in order to acquire a lot of data. I think they sold it again. And we do this in biology where we take molecular data and try to simulate. This is the COVID virus that kept us busy for a few years, but we make predictions on that data. And we use also MRI images and create 3D models to make the surgeons more acquainted with the heart prior to surgery. So we are applying all these models into real practice, or in this case, we take the whole human proteome and duplicate our world through data, and we deliberately publish this as the human proteome database, which is then open sourcely available, where we have all the folded proteins of the human body in a database. And then we can start matching this with molecules and predict how these proteins bond with molecules and use this for pharmaceutical R&D processes. But when we duplicate the world through data, we are duplicating data that is extracted out of our analog world, where we're talking about the biological self, and I use the concept of Luciano Floridi, who talk about that we as humans are not only a biological self, but also an informational self. And yesterday, Amber Case mentioned the technosociological wormholes between the offline and the online world. So I adopted that because I love that concept of technosociological wormholes between that offline and that online world. And when I saw this study from Razorfish that looked at different generations, and we saw that before as well, when we have these young generations yet being more active in that online world and presenting themselves, and you ask them, where do you feel more yourself? Then they feel more themselves in that online world where perhaps the human rights and the values that we share are replaced by terms and conditions of platforms and companies. And that means, for example, there was a company called Replica AI, which is a very problematic AI system where you share all your data and you create a replica of yourself, and you look in the terms and conditions. You might be compliant with GDPR, but you don't own the AI model that represents yourself. So you don't own the self in that case. You don't own your digital twin. And so if you look at all these systems that we are developing and duplicating the world through data, and I use the concept of Habermas and Boltanski, who use the concept of spheres, that we are duplicating that world or transgressing or shifting that data from what we call the public sphere to the digital sphere, or the analog sphere to the digital sphere. And in that digital sphere, we have Wikipedia, we have some sort of commons, but mostly we are turning everything into assets. And if we duplicate that world and we talk about medicine, my biggest worry was that we duplicate a value-based system, and I worked for a US company, IBM, and I was a lot in the US healthcare system, and the biggest fear in healthcare in the US is when you leave the hospital is not that you are cured, but the biggest fear is that you are bankrupt or not. I will give some examples in that sense, and that means that the value system in the US is very different as Europe. Like, everybody knows their right to privacy, but you know that you have the right to healthcare that is written in Article 25. I find it very remarkable that the European Health Data Space proposal by the European Union mentions 32 times the right to privacy, but 0 times the right to healthcare. And that's a policy proposal. And that means that we perhaps might want to create a transatlantic market, but these markets are very different. Our healthcare systems are based on solidarity and not on competition. We try to make these healthcare systems affordable. And the first time I was in Silicon Valley, the total cost of healthcare from GDP was 14%. And after 140 billion of venture capital investments, now we are at 20%. Life expectancy is going down in the US. So there is no metric that whole digitalization that we see is really advancing the system as a whole. So are we going towards a future problem? And I'm a sci-fi fan, and yesterday some people showed as well sci-fi movies because it gives you a perspective of the future. And this is Altered Carbon, a scenario 250 years in the future where you can fly with cars, you can see skyscrapers of 3,000 meters high, you can plug in your consciousness, put it into new bodies, and then there is this hospital scene. And when I was watching this, it was quite remarkable because they fly with a car in the hospital. His girlfriend is shot to death and he needs surgery. And then he identifies her, and then there is written, "You don't have access." Well, he spits on, to make this faster, he spits on it and he has enough credit, so he gets access. But then when you look later, the whole surgery is based on robot surgery. And then I asked myself the question, wow, you can fly with a car, but you cannot be treated by a robot. Is that a realistic scenario? Are we going to keep access to care still class-based? Is that value system that we duplicate through data the same? Is it going to create the same inequalities? And I think, yes, we are heading that way. Because what we are doing is we are creating out of data and AI models what we call in the industry or in the finance world, intangible assets. Like everybody knows a tangible asset is a house. And I live in Berlin, so if there's more demand on houses, these prices go up. And intangible assets is knowledge, is something not physical. And what we are doing in healthcare is we are taking health data, we are taking mostly open source available models, we train them on compute power infrastructure, and then we protect them with so-called legal protections and turn them into what we call non-tangible assets. And different as with commodities is that, as I said before, with assets, the price goes up when the demand goes up. And that's in healthcare not really a good thing to do. Also with assets, the difference is that you mostly sell these assets based on projected future value. And to give you an example, there was a startup that was similar to WhatsApp. They collected a lot of data, but it was patient data, 2 million oncologic records on a cloud, where they asked oncologists, hey, you can use this platform, it's great. And after 330 million of investments, it was sold to Roche for 2.1 billion. They never had revenues, but it was 2 million on patient records that shifted away from the public sphere or perhaps in that open sphere to the private sphere. And Jennifer Hinkle, who I work with, she mentioned this in Stat News, that this is based on the projected future value. So we are taking a mortgage on the health of our children already, because we are extracting already the value through these transactions of things that never created value. And I work since 20 years in the health tech industry, and I've witnessed really strange things, because in technology, mostly my things became cheaper. I have a crazy supercomputer in my pocket. But in healthcare, these things are a bit different, like the price of insulin. Insulin, the patent was sold for $1 to Eli Lilly. Now, in the last 20 years in the US, the price of insulin went up by 1,200%. And last year in the US, 100,000 people died of diabetes. That is not only based on the not accessible insulin, but it's definitely based partly on that high price of insulin. And as you are researchers, you all know the problem with scientific publications. I was 2 weeks ago in Guatemala, and I was shocked that some researchers had problems in publishing because they cannot afford the publishing fees. And these are also non-tangible assets. We turn, as a researcher, when you give your paper to Elsevier, Springer, or whatever, you turn them into a non-tangible asset, which can increase in price. So it's no surprise that this person, I don't know if you know Martin Shkreli, he was a person that bought a pharma patent and then increased the price by 12,000%, and then went to jail for 7 years, is also now doing medical AI. I wasn't a surprise at all for me. So we created this concept called regenerative AI. And why did I create this? Well, it was a while ago that I was at a conference called AI for Good. And there was this Silicon Valley-based search engine company that presented how they were using data in India for diabetics and detecting retinopathy like blindness. And they were also telling, oh, we could also see heart diseases, we could see age, we could see gender, or biological sex out of the data. And I asked 3 questions. I said, did you ask for broad consent? Was the data also shared with the Indian community? And was the AI model that you used being openly published? Of course, I didn't got any positive answer. So I said, well, you're talking here about AI for good, and you're selling this as a sustainable development goal, but there was nothing actually sustainable what you're doing, because what you're doing is repeating the agenda. I'm a Belgian that my grandparents did in Congo, and you're doing data colonialism, and you are doing a non-consensual experiment with the poorest part of our population. I don't think this is what I call good. So I never was invited to that conference anymore, but that's fine, you learn. And I started to learn that these SDGs are being misused because people are branding them, and it's like, oh, we're doing SDG 3. So these sustainable development goals cannot be used singularity because they're all interconnected. You cannot extract the data out of India and then not give startup entrepreneurs the opportunity to independently, in a sovereign way, build their own startups. That's not how I call it sustainable. So if you look at then that concept of spheres, and you look at what the private sphere and the public sphere, then what we are doing is we're shifting data from the public sphere into the private sphere. And we're turning social value into economical value, simplistically told, because we look at data as something that equals capital. And if we do that, data accumulations will follow capital concentrations, and through market consolidations, merger and acquisitions, we will probably be confronted in 10 to 20 years with monopolies of platforms the same way as we have seen it in other ways. So the most incentives that I found is not, we can theorize and all these things and talk about interoperability, but interoperability doesn't make any sense if you turn data into capital, because nobody's going to share that sense. And you're not going to create information asymmetries that probably going to lead to a system that I call, which is designed for inequality. Because if you create information asymmetries in healthcare, that's where you create mostly inequalities. And then I was at a JP Morgan conference in 2008 where a Goldman Sachs analyst told, is curing a disease the right business model? And that's a valid question, because if you want to create assets and your value is based on asset and future projection of asset, and suddenly you create a solution that destroys that market, then you will have to ask these questions as an investor. So what we have been seeing, and I mentioned before, technology is democratizing and getting cheaper and always following that Moore's law in many, many ways. But what we are witnessing is that the price of data is increasing. And even the European health data space has a sort of valuation system, because now the industry can get access to our public data, which is a good thing. But if we start asking a price for it, I don't think it's a good thing. And we just continue that same part, because again, if data equals capital, data accumulations will follow capital concentrations. And these are not in Europe. So data as well is something that should not be scarce, because data, as we just heard yesterday during one of the talks, is exploding. But if we make these things scarce, we can create a sort of value model out of it. So that's why we started rethinking this, like how can we get data and shift it from the private sphere to the public sphere and create really a free flow of information. That's the dream. It's actually written in our European fundamental rights that non-personal information and the free flow of information should be guaranteed. So we need a sort of framework that gives the incentives, and we are working and publishing our first papers. We are not actually doing this with a scientific mindset, but we want to create a framework where we can benchmark systems on. And we are using a concept where we look at extractive versus regenerative AI. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but the idea is that we're going to publish an index where we do social scoring on AI systems in healthcare. And then when a company goes to India and then tells that they're doing good, that we can prove that perhaps this is not so sustainable. And then we can influence their ESG ratings, because most of the ESG ratings are based on data that's been collected by NGOs, non-profits. We're also looking into what we call health data offsetting. That sounds a bit strange with the carbon offsetting, but it's about destroying the imbalances. And if a company really wants to invest 100 million to support open source, I think they should get a certificate that increases their score and give them incentives. I've worked with a Swedish pharmaceutical company. They want to do way, way more, but it's like, well, we don't get the incentives of financial markets, then it's not going to work. Now, there's been a lot of fuss. Everything what we do in AI is probably based on open source. And there's been a lot of fuss on open source. Currently, the AI Act wants to kind of, in Article 38B, destroy the open source movement. But the open source movement in the last 40 months has been amazing, because we had suddenly this shared enemy, which was called OpenAI, which has nothing to do with openness. They used a paper called Attention is All You Need, and then you saw in the last 5 years all these developments. On the lower side, you see all the AI models that are closed, and on the top layer, you see the open source models, in the middle layer, the open source models for research. And you saw a long time nothing. Like there was every year a model being published. And then in 2022, there was GPT-2, GPT-3. There was a lot of suddenly models that the industry was creating. And then there was ChatGPT in November, and then suddenly OpenAI telling we're not going to share anything what we do anymore. And when you do that, you create a lot of enemies. So what we saw in the last 12 months was an explosion of open source collaborations and a growth of a community of millions of people collaborating on that same purpose to create open, accessible AI knowledge. And it started with big tech, big science, which was a collaborative of 1,000 researchers creating a model called Bloom. The first 3 papers of that research papers were just names of people working together. I think we need to work on incentives in research to repeat this kind of success. Once that Bloom was published, OpenAI had to reduce their prices by 2/3, because suddenly that open source competition, that really worked. There was a research paper from Stanford that looked at Bloom and compared this with the alignment of the AI Act, and it was the most aligned model of all the models out there. We saw community growth in a space I've never seen, like a model from Stable LLM. After 1 month, it was uploaded. It was downloaded 2.6 million times. 2.6 million coders getting access to the same language model, starting to create innovation, which leads to cross-pollination, and suddenly you have a model that performs better in a certain domain as GPT-4 and runs on a few GPUs and doesn't need a mass infrastructure. So what actually happens with that community is that one PhD does a little incremental innovation, and the one publishes, and you see these things rapidly gaining speed. And it's something I've never seen in such a speed before. It leads what I call democratization, which is of the people, by the people, and for the people. And it leads to models that we can run in the future on a toaster, so I can speak with my toaster. But it runs on models that you can run on an iOS or Android system. In healthcare, this is happening as well. Diabetics patients are sharing their data on a cloud. The model that you see on the top is the industry model. The lower model is the patient-generated model for controlling hyper and hypoglycemia. And what you see as well is everybody knows AlphaFold. There is now an open source variant, OpenFold, that runs faster. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of people upset with what we're doing in the open source community and starting to create misconceptions telling that open source is dangerous. Now, I give always this example. For 30 years, the military was using a communication system called Tetra. And in Tetra, what researchers recently found was a backdoor deliberately programmed in the encryption model that was there for 30 years. So if open source is dangerous, then for me, closed source is even more dangerous. 30 years it took us to know that somebody was listening in all military communication standards. So don't come with me with a thing that open source is going to create these bad actors, because bad actors are everywhere. And it's our conversations that Gutenberg had with monks when he was telling that he wanted to give everybody access to books. They told him that is as dangerous as giving an infant a candle. I think we need to rethink about these things. I'm not going to go to Jan de Kun, but I will go to the bold statement of Josh Bach, who is one of the most renowned AI researchers in Germany, but if we can have the tone, that would be nice. He made this bold statement. Oh.
Or can give you is regulation that up 80% of AI research for a time, right, or permanently. Or the US government can give you regulation that establishes a permanent monopoly for OpenAI and Google on the existing language models because the others cannot afford to go through the certification process.
So that's what's happening. We are currently, my last few weeks have been extremely busy because we're trying to influence policy to tell, please don't regulate the pre-deployed open source community. I'm all for regulations once things get into application. But it's like publishing a book. When you publish a book as a publisher, you're responsible. But you're not going to start defining who can write and who can buy a pen and who can write whatever on that paper. If you start doing that, you kill open science. You kill open collaboration. And I don't think this runs on the peace and prosperity. I don't think you contribute to T2 factors as well if you do that. So my closing statement is if you really want to create sustainable innovation in healthcare, we need to start collaborating. I think even Maria Montessori told that if we teach our children to collaborate, that's the moment we start building for peace. I think in healthcare, Hippocrates mentioned that a society that has equal access to healthcare is, non-equal access to healthcare is mechanical and unstable. I think that all relates to why we have built a right to access to healthcare. So there is no single reason to not support open source AI, medical AI. And within that regenerative framework, what we try to do is solve the biggest problem of open source is the financing of open source. And that's why we are working with that regenerative AI system. And whoever wants to join us and collaborate with us, you're more than welcome to talk to me. I would be really happy to have that conversation. Thank you very much for your attention.